Our next defence is the defence of innocent dissemination. What if you pass on a defamatory item without being aware of it? So what if you sold someone a book that was defamatory? Technically, you've passed it on to them, you've published it, but this is the defence which would protect an innocent disseminator. Have a look at section 32 of the Defamation Act Queensland. This contains the defence of innocent dissemination, and it makes it clear that it's a defence to the publication of defamatory matter if the defendant proves, that is, the onus is on the defendant, that the defendant published the matter merely in the capacity of being a subordinate distributor or as an employee or agent of a subordinate distributor, and B, the defendant neither knew nor ought reasonably to have known that the matter was defamatory, and C, the defendant's lack of knowledge was not due to any negligence on the part of the defendant. Note there, you've got your and, so and. That's very important. For those who are still in first year, when you do statutory interpretation, you'll learn that if you're reading through a list of elements like this, and it says or, you can, in that situation, only have to prove one of the list. Here, where you've got your and, that means you have to prove A and B and C, or the defence does not exist. The court has to look at what do we mean by a subordinate distributor, and section 32(2) helps us out with that. It gives a definition. It says a person is a subordinate distributor of defamatory matter if they were not the first or primary distributor, and they were not the author or originator of the matter, and they did not have any capacity to exercise editorial control over the content of the matter or over the publication of the matter before it was published. So some examples of this would be if someone had a bookstore and they were selling books, and they're not the first or primary distributor, the publisher is. They didn't write the book, so they're not the author or originator of the matter. And they don't have any capacity to exercise editorial control over the content of that book or over the publication of it before it was first published. In that circumstance, the bookseller is not separately liable for the defamation. They can rely on innocent dissemination as a defence. Otherwise, every time you had a defamatory book, people could sue every bookstore in Australia who sold that book. Instead, you've got to go to the publisher and the author and sue them. Another example might be where someone is, where an entity is a TV station and they're running a live feed from somewhere, say a sporting event or a news item. And in those circumstances, if there was no delay, they couldn't be aware of what was going to be said, they had no ability to review the material before it was broadcast, so it's being broadcast immediately, streaming live, that in those circumstances, they may not be the first or primary distributor if there is a secondary production company involved. They're not the author or originator of a statement made by someone who speaks to the recording crew, and they don't have any capacity to exercise editorial control other than to stop the live feed after they're aware of a defamatory matter. In those circumstances, again, innocent dissemination may apply. So who is a primary distributor of materials? Again, section 32(3) gives some help for this. You should note though, it's without limiting subsection 2A. That means the words primary distributor can be any primary distributor, but this is assistance for the meaning, not a final, complete definition. Have a look at that section and it talks about what that person might be. Some people to be aware of, and people who are likely to be relying on this defence of innocent dissemination, are internet service providers. They have a defence under the Broadcasting Services Act, Schedule 5, Clause 91(1), and that will assist where they're merely facilitating people to access information that is hosted by someone else, and the internet service provider is acting merely as a conduit. There can be a failure to make out this defence if there is some control exercised over the information which is presented. So in one of the many Trikula cases, Trikula number 5, where Mr. Trikula was suing in relation to search results that were coming up. Google failed to make out a defence of innocent dissemination because they had automated a system which caused certain information to be presented as part of the search results. So they actually had some power over what information was presented as the result of a search. In addition, you'll find that they were also found to be liable in situations where their auto correction of or their auto search results pop up. However, in the case of Google Incorporated and Trikula, where the search engine merely returned images without any selection of description of the images, etc., whereas in an earlier one there was descriptions of the search engine of the search results, which were selected through Google's scripts, and they controlled the programming scripts that selected the information. In Trikula, they said where it's merely an image and those images come up and there's no additional selection, control over framing, etc. It's merely the image exists and here it is. In those circumstances, the judge did think that perhaps a search engine could argue that it was a secondary publisher and that innocent dissemination had occurred. However, you should note that wasn't directly argued in the case, and that matter is also coming up for High Court appeal. There was a hearing on the 21st of March, but we don't have a judgment yet. So it's going to depend on whether there is any exercise of editorial control over the results of that search at all. Finally, you should also note that Australia Post has immunity from actions for defamation for delivery of postal items. Because technically, if you think about it, if they hand over a letter that someone else has written, entrusted to them, and they pass on, they could meet the definition of a publisher. But the Act, the Australian Postal Corporation Act, makes it very clear that merely by delivering items, then Australia Post is immune from actions for defamation. Of course, if they create their own information, for example, putting out a brochure and then delivering it to you, their brochure might be subject to a defamation action, but merely passing on someone else's letter without having any control over it, it's very clear they're immune from actions in defamation. So that's innocent dissemination, a defence which protects those who don't have any real control over the content of the defamatory matter and who merely pass it on as a secondary publisher and they have no editorial control over it. It's always a useful one to think about.